My sister-in-law, Diane's twin sister, Linda, visited us for a week this summer. It was really nice to see her. I'm sure many of you have had similar experiences this summer. Most of us haven't done much traveling for the past year and a half. And so this summer, Americans all over the country took the opportunity to go on trips. We hadn't seen Linda except on Zoom for about a year and a half since the pandemic. Anyway, while she was here, we decided, of course, to go to see NASA. I mean, what other iconic tourist site would you take a visitor to Houston? Okay, there's Kenny and Ziggy's. Maybe Herman Park or the Art Museum. Anyway, we went to NASA. And we took the tram ride to the astronaut training facility, where astronauts are training for future missions and scientists and engineers are developing the next generation of space exploration vehicles. And we also saw some pretty cool-looking robots. And we went through an exhibit that showed the history of NASA's exploration of space from the earliest rockets, the Mercury, the Gemini, and the Apollo spacecrafts that made history, with humans orbiting the Earth and then traveling to the moon and back. And the exhibit continued with the International Space Station, the unmanned missions to Mars, and the planning for the first human visit to the Red Planet. It's hard to believe that in one short decade, in the 1960s, we went from sending the first human being to orbit around the Earth to the first humans to walk on the moon. And speaking of that, it was exactly 50 years ago this evening that Apollo 15 made history with the first lunar rover excursion on the moon. NASA had actually engineered a car that could travel through the rough terrain of the lunar surface with its radical temperatures and deadly solar radiation. And it also had to be light enough and compact enough to fit inside the spacecraft. It was truly a remarkable engineering triumph. And all of this got me thinking, what would Moses say? What would Abraham say? Now, I know that's probably not the first question that you had in your mind, but I'm a rabbi, so you know. So Moses lived about 3,200 years ago, and we know that even people who lived hundreds of years later, maybe 2,500 years ago, still thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. The sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars all orbited around the Earth in concentric circles. If you have heard the expression seven heavens, it comes from the ancient belief that the sun, moon, and the five known planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, each were fixed in one of these spheres, making a total of seven. The Jewish tradition adopted this idea of seven heavens as well, and it's found in the Talmud and Midrash. The idea that heaven is up there somewhere still seems to be popular to this day, even though we have sent astronauts up there, and we even sent the Hubble telescope up there. And that telescope allows us to see galaxies several billion light years away. We've seen the far reaches of the universe. And, of course, nowhere did anyone see angels floating around a divine throne. I hope I'm not bursting anybody's bubble tonight. Okay, so yes, Abraham, Moses, and even the rabbis of the Talmud 2,000 years ago believed the earth was the center of the universe and that God resided up in the heavens beyond the sun, moon, and stars. And that's just not how we understand the cosmos today. But that does not necessarily mean that there's no God or even that there's no heaven, God forbid. We just need to readjust our thinking about these matters. So almost exactly 52 years ago this evening was the first Apollo mission to land on the moon, Apollo 11. The lunar module of that Apollo spacecraft was nicknamed the Eagle, and it landed on a crater they called the Sea of Tranquility on the lunar surface on July 20th, 1969. Flight Commander Neil Armstrong radioed NASA the famous words, "Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." And as he set foot on the lunar surface for the first time, he uttered perhaps the most often quoted words of the mission: "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." What is less well known is that his flight partner, Buzz Aldrin, was a devout Presbyterian. Before leaving the lunar module to explore the moon, Buzz had brought with him a communion kit from his church, and he took communion. Just before he did, he radioed this to Earth: "I'd like to take this opportunity to ask every person listening in, whoever and wherever they may be, to pause for a moment and contemplate the events of the past few hours and to give thanks in his or her own way." Now, you'll notice that Aldrin did not make any reference to any religious prayers, and the reason for that was that NASA was actually in litigation at the time with an atheist who had filed a lawsuit complaining that during the Apollo 8 mission, the astronauts had read the first few lines of the first chapter of Genesis as they gazed at the planet Earth from space. Nevertheless, a few days later, on July 23rd, as the astronauts prepared for splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, the three spacemen gave short final speeches, and this is what Aldrin said at that time: "This has been far more than three men on a mission to the moon, more still than the efforts of a government and industry team, more even than the efforts of one nation. We feel that this stands as a symbol of the insatiable curiosity of all mankind to explore the unknown. Personally, in reflecting on the events of the past several days, a verse from Psalms comes to mind. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him?" 52 years later, here we are. And so tonight, I have some thoughts that I've reflected on about the amazing human achievements of NASA, as well as other nations' space programs. First, as I mentioned earlier, we all know that God's domain is not in some special place that our ancestors called heaven, as they pointed to the clear blue sky above us. There is no specific place in the universe where God resides. God has no body or physical form, according to our belief, and therefore does not and cannot exist in any particular location. Today, we might say that God exists outside the space-time continuum. But thanks to our study of space, we can appreciate in a much more profound way the brilliance of God's creation in all its vastness, all its complexity, and all its sophistication. Looking at the Earth as the astronauts did in Apollo 8, it is no wonder they chose to read the opening verses of Genesis. By the way, the lawsuit was dismissed. Whether or not that was a valid First Amendment claim or not, it's irrelevant for how we Jews can choose to interpret the sight of our planet from space. God is not up there per se, but I am humbled and inspired and awestruck and amazed when I consider God's creation, every bit as much as our ancestor who wrote Psalm 8 that Buzz Aldrin quoted at the end of Apollo 11 mission. And this leads me to my second thought: why is God mindful of us? Here on this exquisite but fragile little globe in the vastness of space. In the early morning prayers we're supposed to recite each day, we recite a similar question: Master of all worlds, what are we? What is our life? Our goodness, our righteousness, our achievements, our powers, our victories. What shall we say in your presence? In your presence, our lives seem futile, and all is vanity. Surely, though, we are your people, adherents to your covenant, descendants of Abraham, whom you loved, the seed of Isaac, the congregation of Jacob, whom you renamed Israel and Yeshurun. Why is God mindful of us? Because God created humanity, as we learn from Genesis, to be God's agents in our world, with free will, so that we could choose our own destiny, with the ability to think, to create, to love, and to explore. We can use our imagination. We can tell stories. We can inspire others. We can forge relationships. We can build sacred communities. But all of these powers were given to humanity so that we can be God's agents in bringing love and compassion, hope and prosperity, freedom and dignity, justice and fairness into the world. When seen from outer space, the world looks so small. Our petty grievances become microscopic. From that perspective, from God's perspective, selfishness and greed, prejudice and bigotry are pointless, even ridiculous. Which leads to my third and last thought for this evening. We sent men, and they were all men back then, to the moon in the 1960s. There was a Cold War, a threat of nuclear war, a war in Vietnam. There were protests, sometimes violent ones, against racial prejudice and inequality. There were human-caused threats to the environment, which led then President Nixon to create the Environmental Protection Agency. Many Americans at the time wondered why we spent so much money to go to the moon when there were so many problems and so much poverty here at home. But going to the moon spun off many scientific advances, too numerous to discuss this evening. It inspired us to invent, to create, and to transform our world. And most importantly, it gave us that perspective on how small our planet is in the vastness of space. It is inspiring to live here in Houston, Texas, where President Kennedy launched the space program in September 1962, and a short drive away from NASA's Space Center Houston, which offers the public a glimpse into the brilliance of the work of our scientists and engineers. The coming decades will once again be a time of change and challenge, decades of hope and fear in an age of both knowledge and ignorance, as President Kennedy said 59 years ago. I hope that in the years ahead, we will continue to explore what is out there in space, but that also we will use that creative energy to find solutions to all of the challenges we still have here on Earth. We should use that image of the Earth to remind us of the fragility of our planet, to remind us of the pettiness of our disputes and conflicts, to remind us of the blessings we enjoy in God's creation. In short, to remind us of what is truly important and the mission that God has given to humanity to make this world as God intended it to be, as God described it at the end of creation, when God said, "V'hine tov ma'od," behold, it is very good. Shabbat shalom.